One of the things I love about working with scientists and engineers is that they really demand precision. They want clear answers. They don't like this wishy-washy, this could be right or that could be right, it all depends. They want to know. So, for example, if I say this sentence is better than that, well, they want to know why. And so in order to give them answers that my students are always demanding, I really had to go deep into understanding the structure underpinning the language. And that's really what this module is all about. And the deeper I went into this, the more I discovered that in language, there really are clear answers about right and wrong. Now, one of the most important things about teaching a language is controlling the affect, the mood of the students in the classroom. Because when a student has high anxiety, they're not going to be able to absorb the language. And when they're feeling good and comfortable, well, that's when you can learn the language more freely. And if anybody has told themselves they're a bad English speaker, but then had a glass of wine or two and suddenly became super fluent, you know exactly what I'm talking about. When that barrier, that anxiety barrier goes down, your access to the language greatly improves. So for that reason, generally in language classes, there is this kind of approach where we say, oh, everything's okay, don't worry about it, there's no such thing as mistakes in the language learning classrooms. But scientists and engineers, I came to discover, really don't like this approach. At least when it comes to writing, they demand precision. They want to know why one answer is correct and the other one is incorrect. If one answer is right or the other is wrong, or one is better than the other, then there must be some system underneath it that we can point to whenever we're making these decisions. Now, as these science students badgered me with questions about, why this one is right and that one is wrong, they really forced me to sharpen up and go deep into the language to figure out, what's going on underneath it. And I've got to say, it was a really fun journey for me. I made some great discoveries that I'm really excited to share with you. And after spending all this time at a science and tech institute, I've been able to connect these discoveries I made about the language to concepts that are going to be very familiar for you in the sciences. Things like atoms, protons, neutrons, they all serve as a really useful analogy for what's happening when we are building meaning. So this is the final result of all that teaching. And this module is going to give you a roadmap that you can follow as you progress and develop as a writer. If you follow this module to the end, then you are going to have at your disposal every sentence structure that you could possibly want to use. Really, we're going to cover them all. And it's not just going to be a listicle of 40 sentence structures that you should memorize. I think it's a pretty straightforward path. So I can't wait to show it to you. Let's get into it. Okay, so in this module, we're basically going to be looking at the tools you need to become a better writer. Now, I've had the great fortune of working with scientists and engineers here in South Korea for many years, and what I've come to find is that these people are exceptional writers. And it makes a lot of sense. I mean, here in South Korea, you've had English throughout your entire education, and as scientists and engineers, you know how important it is to be fluent in English, especially in the writing portion of it. Not so much conversationally, but certainly if you want to publish your research, you're going to need to reach a certain level of fluency in the language. And what I find in my experience is that many of these writers will have a very impressive vocabulary and a very easy use of a facility with sentence structures. But there's a kind of plateau, isn't there? We come to a certain point in our language journey, and it's difficult to reach that highest level. So what do I mean? Well, we can take a look at what I mean by the higher levels. By looking at the TOEFL IBT exam, this gives us a pretty standard measure of English fluency development, and we see at the highest level, there's this emphasis on what they call syntactic variety. If you want to get a 5 out of 5 on the TOEFL IBT exam, they want to see syntactic variety, which basically just means a variety of sentence structures. The structures underneath the language. Vocabulary is important as well, but at the highest level, they want to see some facility, some ease with your use of different sentence structures. And we're going to take a look at some common sentence structures that we see in English learner writing. And of course, this whole module is about how to improve that, how to develop a larger repertoire of sentence structures. So this is it for TOEFL IBT, and we see the same thing when we look at the IELTS exam. The upper bands of the IELTS exam emphasize a wide range of structures. And in both the TOEFL exam and the IELTS exam, they also stress the importance of accuracy. So flexibility and ease and accuracy. What is accuracy? Well, it's not simply enough to fill a page with these different sentence structures and say, there's a variety. In terms of accuracy, we want to be using them properly. So when we think about how to use them properly, we're going to be thinking of these grammar structures less as rules or anything like that. They're going to be tools, things that you can use to best convey your intended meaning. So we're going to be looking at these structures throughout this module. Now, this problem of getting learners beyond that intermediate level, it's something that I've been thinking about for a while. And one time I came across a study from the 1960s by somebody named Kellogg Hunt. And in Hunt's study, so here's what he did. He was examining basically the progress, the development of student writing. So he was examining writing from students in the 4th grade all the way up to the 12th grade and looking at patterns in this change of development. This is in native speakers, but it still holds true for English learners as well. And what Hunt finds, this is a long quote, the heart of it is right over here. It says, little sentences grow into big sentences. That's the basic message. I'm going to read this to you, and then we're going to break it down and look at some examples of what Hunt is talking about when he tells us about the progress that students make when they move from the 4th grade all the way up to the 12th grade in their writing. So Hunt says, when students begin to write, they use single clauses or they conjoin sentences. That's step 1. Later, they use relative clauses, embedding rather than conjoining. So there's an important difference between conjoining, which we'll explain in a moment, and embedding, kind of joining them one inside the other. So that's step 2. And then beyond here, he says they reduce many of those relatives into restrictive phrases. It's fine if you don't know what this means yet, but this is giving us a roadmap, something that we can follow when we think about how to get ourselves beyond this intermediate level to an upper advanced level. He says the 3rd step is that we reduce these relative phrases into restrictive phrases. And finally, at the very end, at the highest level of fluency, Hunt says that the better writers begin using more non-restrictive modifiers. That's at the end of this module. We'll be looking at non-restrictive modifiers. And they generally employ, and this is the big thing about accuracy and flexibility, they generally employ a large repertoire, large collection, let's say, large repertoire of structures, restrictive and non-restrictive. So again, this is a long description. It's kind of loaded with some grammatical concepts. Don't worry too much about it. We're going to take a closer look at it, and I'll be able to give you some examples of what Hunt is talking about here. So when we look at level 1, I'm calling that bronze level, level 3, right? This is when students begin to write. They use simple clauses or they conjoin clauses. So here's an example of student writing from one of my reading and writing classes that was taken at the beginning of the semester. So it's a pretty good example of where many of you might find yourself today. What's going on in this? Well, let's take a close look at what Hunt calls simple sentences. The majority, I think, except for one sentence in this entire section, they're all written exclusively in simple sentences. Simple sentences, that's a technical grammatical term. It just means a subject and a predicate. There are no complex structures hanging off of it. So here's an example of one. If we put it into the syntax structure, we see that the sentence says, by X-ray diffraction, we can find out the detailed structure of every protein that is meaningful for humans. Now, don't worry too much if you don't know what exactly we mean by subject, verb, phrase, complement. This is all going to unfold as we move along. But the important thing here just to notice is that this structure, this subject, verb, phrase, complement, that's basically every sentence in this student's writing. And it's a great example of upper intermediate style writing, because not only do we have these simple sentences, sometimes we join them, as we see here. So the student is taking these simple sentences and just kind of joining them one after the other using these tools that we call coordinating conjunctions. But as writers progress, they tend to use these a lot less than some of the other sentence structures that we're going to be looking at. So this is very typical of intermediate student writing. You're going to have a lot of simple sentences, usually just alone, single sentences, but when they're joined, they're going to be joined either with these coordinating conjunctions or sentence connectors, which are otherwise known as transitions. Things like however, therefore, these kinds of things. They're all fine, but we're not getting the kind of variety of syntax that these upper bands are looking for. We just have chains of simple sentences joined together. And you probably, I'm assuming many of you are Korean speakers because we're here on the Star MOOC network. So I'll give you an example from Korean. Tell me if, well, you won't tell me, but see if this is true for you. It's certainly true in English. If you were to ask a child, hey, what did you do today? You know, the child might say something like, I woke up and I brushed my teeth and I went to school and I played with my friends and right? So, I mean, in Korean, that would be something like go, 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 했어요, right? That's fine, but I think if you can hear that, if you can hear somebody speaking in that way, all of those clauses, all of those simple sentences are given equal emphasis. They're given equal emphasis because the coordinating conjunction or a sentence connector, like however, they don't tell you which one is important. You're just hammering these things together and you have this long chain. So as you know, if a child were to speak that way, you would know pretty quickly that they have a somewhat limited range of language development. And the same thing is true at this level. So this is an example of what Hunt is saying is a basic kind of level, and it's the place we're trying to get you beyond, right? So what's the second level that Hunt identifies? He says later they use relative clauses, embedding rather than conjoining. Okay, so this is where we move beyond conjoining with coordinating conjunctions and sentence connectors. When we're embedding, it's a lot like these matryoshka dolls, these Russian matryoshka dolls. I hope I'm saying that correctly. I've never actually heard that word, but I think it's matryoshka dolls, the doll inside of a doll inside of a doll. These dolls are embedded. They're all identical. The structure of them is identical, but there's one main doll, one matrix doll, and the other ones are embedded. Embedded means, you can think of it as they're put in the same bed together. They are joined together in the same unit. But this is a pretty good example of what Hunt is talking about when he says embedding. Let's take a look at this sentence. It says, the present government, this is about nuclear power in South Korea. So it says, the present government is pushing ahead a new enactment that is permitting new constructions of nuclear power plants. Okay, so if we look at this structure, it's not the one that we saw before, which is simple sentence, simple sentence, simple sentence, all joined together. We actually have one basic clause, which serves as the matrix of the entire sentence. And then embedded inside that clause, we have other phrases. We have noun phrases and non-finite noun clauses that are kind of baked into this. So this is the kind of thing that they're looking for on these tests. And for native speakers or readers, this is going to be the kind of thing that they're looking for whenever they're even subconsciously assessing fluency. It's this use of embedding structures. Why do we do this? It's not to be fancy. This is a very economical way to write. By which I mean you're using fewer pieces in order to convey the same meaning. If you were to communicate this sentence as a string of simple sentences, it would be pretty hard to follow. You wouldn't know what the important part is. Here's an example. Here's another example of the higher levels where we actually see reductions. So this sentence at the bottom here, I'll read it for you. It says, RPN, which proposes the position of the objects from feature maps extracted by using the convolutional network, is the most distinguishing feature in this neural network. Okay, it's pretty good. What's going on here? Well, if you kind of disassemble it, what you're going to find is that it's essentially made up of 3 clauses, 3 simple sentences. We have at the bottom, the feature maps are extracted by using the convolutional network. Okay, and what we do, this is what Hunt calls reducing. We reduce this clause by deleting the subject and deleting a redundant verb. And so now we embed, I like to think of it as baking. We're going to bake that clause inside of the adverb position of the next clause. So now the next clause says, RPN proposes the position of the objects from feature maps. See, if a child were saying this, they would say something like, RPN proposes the position of the objects from feature maps, and feature maps are extracted from the, you see what I mean? So we're knocking off those kind of redundant extra pieces of the language, and we're making it simpler for the reader to follow. So now what do? We're going to take this clause now that we've embedded something into, and we're going to try to insert it into the top clause, the matrix clause. And so what we do, we see RPN and RPN on top of each other. We don't need to say it twice. So we're going to delete that and replace it with a relative pronoun, which or that, but we'll talk about that more later. So we replace it with which, and now we're going to try to insert it into the matrix clause. And we do that with the use of commas. So this is known as a non-restrictive relative clause. We've done a lot of reduction. We've taken these essentially 3 clauses and we've knocked them down, shaved them down so that they're very economical, very light. It's a much lighter sentence than wait. It's easier for the reader to move through it than the one that has the 3 simple sentences chained together. So this is the kind of writing that we're going to be looking at in this module. We're starting at this basic level, and we're going to be looking at the different kinds of sentence structures, as Hunt suggests, in that same order, in order to get ourselves to something like this. Now, the last part of Hunt's analysis, his description of the way that students progress in their writing, Hunt says that the better writers begin using more non-restrictive modifiers. Don't worry about that. We'll look at what that is later. More non-restrictive modifiers, and they generally employ a large repertoire of structures, restrictive and non-restrictive. So this larger repertoire of structures, that's exactly what we were talking about at the beginning with the test. They're talking about a large variety of sentence structures. So that's what we're going for here. In order to get this across, we're going to be looking at grammar. Grammar is a very important piece of this module because in order to understand the structures, well, we need to see them. Now, many students I've worked with here in Korea have developed an impressive speaking and listening ability. That has to do with the input they've taken in. They've probably watched a lot of movies and listened to a lot of language, and so they're quite fluent in the speaking, but they don't quite know why they're saying it this way. And without understanding what's happening at the structural level, they will not be able to understand how to correct their own writing. So we are going to be looking at grammar. However, I promise you that this is not going to be the same kind of approach to grammar that you took when you were studying, for example, for the Sunung, the big standardized test here in Korea. That's not what we're going for. If I could teach this any other way without talking about grammar, I would, because people really don't like it. However, what I've found in my classes is actually scientists and engineers, if you present it to them in the right way, they actually love grammar because it's so structural, so organized. There are clear right and wrong answers. And it's a great contrast to language classes, which can be rightly a little bit more loose and a little bit more fun, and don't worry if you're making mistakes and that kind of thing. That's a great attitude to take whenever you are developing in a language. But again, we're not at the beginning level now. I'm assuming, if you can understand me up until this point, that you are at an intermediate level and you're trying to get yourself beyond that level. And so in order to do that, we've got to take a look at grammar, but I'm going to do my very best to present it to you in a way that that you might not have gotten in the traditional language classroom. So one of my favorite science books of all time is Gödel, Escher, and Bach by Donald Hofstadter. And at one point, there's a great diagram. He's talking about networks, and he represents the semantic network that is in his head. Basically, the web of connections between all the different ideas and concepts and memories in his mind. It looks like a plate of spaghetti. And so the really interesting thing to think about is, how do we go from our own internal experience, this messy web of associations and half-formed ideas and different voices, all the things that are the total mess that's going on in our mind. How do we go from that plate of spaghetti to language? How do we share a coherent thought with another person? Now, the really interesting thing, I think, about language is the way it lets us move from this mess of our own minds to coherent messages that the other person can understand. Now, for this reason, Steven Pinker, the cognitive scientist, he says in his book, The Sense of Style, that language is the original SMS, the social media sharing app. Because what do we do on social media? It's a technology that lets us share ideas and messages and memes with our networks, with our friends. Similarly, language, long before Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, language is what let us do that. Language is the technology that we developed and used to move from that messy web of associations that's going on in our own private world to take a piece of that and share it with another person. Language is the technology that we use to do that. And so the way we move from that messy web of concepts and ideas to a string of meaning is by organizing that messy web of concepts into a tree, into a structure. And that's what we're going to represent in this next section. Now, when presenting grammar to students, I love to begin with this metaphor, which I came across in a book called Doing Grammar by Max Morenberg. If you're a language geek like me, I highly recommend it, because that book changed the way that I look at language. So what is grammar really? Well, an excellent way to think about it is to think of it as a machine. It's a machine that produces the sentences of a language. A language is not just, this pile of words. We need to give it some structure in order for them to mean anything. Let me show you what I mean. So here's a list of random words. We have nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, no precise order. And if we just take some of these words at random, we see they don't mean anything. She, Sam, usually, Annabelle, window. Doesn't mean anything, right? My George, often, his, stroked. Doesn't mean anything, right? Sam, she, his, car, my. Okay. Here's another one. Sam, George, my, face, wash. So you get the point. If we just take words, it's not enough just to know words and to have a large vocabulary. We need to put them into the grammar machine in order to give these words any meaning at all. In order for them to refer to the world, to mean anything, we need to bring them together into a structure. And that's what the grammar machine does. So when we put these words into a grammar machine, it gives us a sentence. It gives us something that means something. That's the key idea. So put them into the grammar machine and we get, Sam never stroked his window. Okay, now I don't know why Sam is never stroking his window or why that's a problem for some people, but he never does it. The goldfish usually liked my face. Okay, again, I don't know why a goldfish would like your face in terms of the context, but you understand, you can picture this. That's a key feature of something meaning something, is you can imagine it. George seldom struck his dog. Well, I guess that's a good thing, but again, I don't know who George is. I don't know who the dog is, but you see, this is telling a story. In linguistics, we say it's making an argument. It's saying that something is true. And you, as the listener or the reader, you can test whether it's true or false. There's nothing to test about Sam, George, my face washed. It can't be true or false. But once we put these words into a grammar machine, they become arguments. They become statements about the world that we can test, the validity of which we can test. So what is this grammar machine? Well, let's take a look. If we look inside the grammar machine, we see there are basically two structures. There are just two structures. This is kind of an exciting thing to realize. Like, if we're going to be looking at a lot of different concepts and sentence structures, and we're basically going to cover everything you need to know in terms of English syntax. So if you follow along, you will have mastered all the possible sentence structures you could write in the English language. But at this beginning place, it's kind of interesting to note that at the bottom of it all, there are basically just two structures. Two things that you need to make. That's a great thing. Like, I'm not going to give you a list of 40 sentence structures to memorize. You really only need to get comfortable with these two structures, because the point is, at the bottom of every single sentence, no matter how long, no matter how the vocabulary that's in it, at the bottom there is only these two structures. There is a finite clause and a noun phrase. Now, why is there an atom here and why is there a suitcase there? Well, you're going to find out whenever we look at these in the next section. But for now, just understand that inside the grammar machine, inside the machine that gives our language meaning, there are basically only two pieces, two structures that you need to know. And so that's it. In review, we just need to know that grammar is not a list of rules. I promise you, I'm not going to be your grade school teacher who is preparing you for the standardized tests and just giving you a list of rules. It's not that. These are tools. As a writer, you have an intended meaning and you're trying to get that out somehow, and you need to think, okay, what's the best way to do this? And when you really know what the tools are that you have, it's going to allow you to express yourself more accurately, more precisely, more comfortably, more fluently. So grammar is not a list of rules, it's a list of choices. In English, importantly, meaning is conveyed through word order. Now, you know this logically, but you might not completely appreciate it when you're writing, because a very common early mistake is that, writers will not pay such careful attention to where they're putting pieces. And if you're a Korean native speaker, that makes a lot of sense, because in the Korean language, meaning is not expressed through word order. Meaning is expressed through the use of particles. So you have these particles, I, ga, nun, ur, that, and when you attach those to the base form, that's what gives your sentence meaning. So although there's a normal pattern that you would follow, in terms of where you would put the topic marking particle and the, everything like that, there is a kind of conventional formula that you would follow. It's not necessary. You could still have them kind of jumbled up. And so long as those pieces are there, you understand the sentence. So in a language like Korean, word order is not so important. But in English, it is, that's the machine. It's the most important thing, the word order. So we're going to be paying careful attention to those structures, the order in the noun phrase and the order in the finite clause in this module. And finally, the big point is that if you want to get yourself beyond this intermediate level and hit that kind of upper level of fluency, then you're going to need to not only be aware of the different kinds of sentences there are, but to really know how to use them, know when to use them, know why you're using them. So, by the end of this module, I should be able to look at your writing and say, why did you choose this sentence? And you should have an answer. And you will be able to answer that question by the end of this. That's where we're going. So in the next section, let's take a look at finite clauses.